Hey everyone, Social Solipsist here. I am making this sort of as a response video, so to speak, even though I hate that term, to my friend Spencer's video regarding walking simulators. Mostly not as a rebuttal, but as a let's call it a continuing dialogue. This is not going to be a series of any kind or any part of an ongoing series, I don't think. I'll let it go where it will. This video is probably going to be an entire mess of just me being rambly and overlaying this over whatever footage I have, quite possibly some an old video that I just run at like half speed or something like that. We'll see how long this runs and see where it goes. So, talking about walking simulators, just let's start there, I suppose. This video won't really be about walking simulators, but let's start there since that's what the prompt was, so to speak. So, I think that there's a lot to defend about walking simulators. Not in their current iteration. I don't want to keep saying walking simulators for this entire video. So let's come up with a different term. Let's say non-combat third-person experiences or first-person experiences. Let's not say that. It's a better term though. Even though it's such a freaking mouthful, the idea of a walking simulator just boggles me because let's look at the reason why a walking simulator should exist at all, or where they came from, I suppose. So, to me, the idea of a walking simulator is just the absence of a genre, in a sense, because typically a first-person game up until the last couple of years, with the advent of the walking simulator, most notably Dear Esther as the kind of kicking off point for the genre. Pretty much every first-person game was a shooter, occasionally an RPG. In the case of the Elder Scrolls and a few others, or some of the really old early 90s RPGs, that sort of thing. But basically what we're looking at with a combat simulator, or with a combat simulator, a walking simulator, is just it's a first or even theoretically third person game that has no combat. So where does that come from? I would argue that started a long ways earlier with, at least in my mind, what I like to think about is games specifically from BioWare's wheelhouse, games like KOTOR and Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, and a few other notables like that, where the whole game is clearly, the combat is in some sense the focus, but a good amount of your time, arguably a majority of your time, is not spent in combat. It's spent in negotiations. You're exploring a world, and it's a world that you're meant to experience either as yourself or as a character that's been predefined for you, and to explore the world both in its sort of nascent form, but also the emergent dialogue that happens with the characters that have been placed there for you to experience. And this is where we start to get into a little bit of combat regarding writing and things like that, because I will agree with my friend in many senses that in many times, walking simulators these days are really an excuse for people who don't have a whole lot of writing talent or don't know how to structure a story or a world, do any sort of world building properly, think that, this is a means to cut corners. And yes, it is. And often those corners can be cut fairly effectively. A game that was mentioned was the Stanley Parable, which is honestly one of my favorite games. I wouldn't put it on my top whatever list, but it's still one of my favorite games purely because it doesn't overstay its welcome. It knows exactly how long it needs to be there to do what it wanted to do, and before you notice the holes that it has. and it's a unique experience, contrary to the sort of RPG exploration, talking with people in a world type of thing. It's more of an emergent experience of, hey, we wanted to tell a story, but in a way that could not be articulated through another medium. There's a narrator. It's the closest thing actually I could compare it to might be the film Stranger Than Fiction, which is a surprisingly unknown film, where the main character, who you are watching in real time on screen, is being narrated sort of in real time by a somewhat fourth wall breaking narrator. And Stanley Parable is really, that's the closest I can compare Stanley Parable to. And in that sense, I think that's where Stanley Parable excels. I haven't played a whole lot of other walking simulators, mostly because I'm so put off by them very, very quickly, just in the experience. But often the reason the sort of modern walking simulator fails, I think, is because the ideas haven't been fleshed out enough for the duration that the game wishes itself to be played. And especially when you are working with sort of a tight budget, presumably a tight budget, a lot of indie devs making these things, you got to know where to spend what little money you have. And in a walking simulator, every penny should be put into first making sure that world is airtight, even if it's got like corners chopped off. If the edges have all been buffed out and big signs of, hey, don't look over here, so to speak. That's number one. And number two is making sure that your story is your story worth telling? Is your story meant to be told in a 3D universe that requires you to interact with it? Would it not be better off in a different medium? And so then you can get into sort of a mental debate, because I don't know anybody who's made a walking simulator. You get into the question of, well, why does somebody make a walking simulator? What prompts someone to make a walking simulator? Is it someone who has game development knowledge, but not a lot of writing knowledge, and wants to do something there? Is it someone who has writing knowledge and not a lot of game development knowledge, but the amount of game dev knowledge they need to, build something with existing assets or something like that? Is that the type of person who comes into it? I think it's more likely the latter, or the former rather than the latter. But the third option, of course, is somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of experience with either. With somebody who doesn't have the doesn't have the experience required, I think, in both. Because you really do require both to make a good experience like that. The thing about a walking simulator is you don't have combat. You don't have a whole bunch of these other things that can distract from, plot holes or poor voice acting or, crappy art assets or whatever else. So you have to nail those things on the nose. You got to get them exactly right. And again, the Stanley Parable and the other games by those folks, who I think they currently go by the team's name is Crows. They knew what they were doing. They knew exactly where they could spend their time in terms of writing. They knew exactly how much editing they needed to do. And they knew exactly how large they could make their experience with their budget. And I played the Stanley Parable probably more than I should have, more than anyone should have. I think I put like 3 hours into it. And that's theoretically a game you can put, that I could have put, at least I could have put 10 minutes into and been happy with my purchase. But very often you get people who have the idea that they can write something and put it into a universe and make it an experience by filling the gaps in one portion of their media with the other. You know, if their story doesn't hold up, they can fill it in with set pieces. If their graphics don't hold up, they can fill it with, you know, dialogue or what have you. And that's, I think, where the walking sims really start to fall through a lot and very consistently. I can tell I'm getting really rambly on this, but I still think this is going to go on for a while, I'm sure. I wish I could make this more succinct and refine my points, but I don't feel like making this an all-day project. Anyway. So yeah, and a lot of those stories that end up being walking simulators would be much better off being well-edited, concise novellas or short stories or what have you, rather than a walking sim. But because the tools are so readily available these days, and because the distribution is so readily available these days, anyone thinks they can do it. And this is where we're going to get a little... I have planned this out a little bit. This is where I'm going to go a little off and start talking about art as the concept of art as a thing. So bear with me, I hope. I hope you'll bear with me on this. So, a lot of other media people get into... Well, okay. When someone chooses to be a musician, or a painter, or a writer, or any of what might be considered sort of the classical arts, typically people don't go into those things for the money. For a multitude of reasons, that's true. One, first and foremost, is because for the most part in Western culture, it's not something that pays well. Unless you really hit it big, your book is not going to make you a millionaire, probably. Your painting is not going to make you a millionaire. Your one song, your one album is not going to make you a millionaire. People who do art do it because it's something that comes from deep inside them, an urge to write, an urge to paint, an urge to express the inexpressible, and articulate that to others, in so many ways. And I could go into, the purity of art and blah de blah, and the various levels of is writing a less pure form of art because it uses human constructed words or what have you. But I won't go there, I promise. Even though I'd sort of like to. But what I'm getting at here is you don't go into art for the sake of the money. But people go into game dev all the time for the sake of the money. I would argue that is the majority of people who go into game development, is because they think, I've got an idea that is good enough, and if I build it right, people pay me a lot. And this amuses the hell out of me because um, not only are we living in an era where the tools to build a game are so readily available to anyone for, you know, pennies or nothing, and the markets are so filled with schlock, unrefined, you know, things that could be something someday if they had a critical eye on them, but they don't. And they end up on marketplaces, be it Steam, unfortunately, be it, you know, one of the smaller things like Desura or ModDB or something like that, where it may be for a small amount or free. And they think this is how I take off. But the economy of game development is a monstrous, horrible beast. You know, if you pay enough attention to game news, you can get a pretty good sense, I think, for what it's like to be a developer of any size, and how horrible and unpleasant it can be. It's something that a lot of people go into very lightly, thinking it'll be, you know, something that isn't too difficult. But for every person who has a great vision and a great piece of writing and a great idea of what the game and the art and the other representations of their writing should be, there are 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 people who think that is the case for them as well, and have the exact same ability to get their stuff out there, but none of the same art. And of course, you know, art is subjective. You know, there's plenty of art out there that is, you know, that only a very few people like. But I'm gonna argue that that's not a valid point for game development, because, well, I don't know if it's invalid, but it's less valid because so many people go into it for the money. You know, those 10,000 or 100,000 who aren't that one person with vision probably go into it for the money, or at least a decent percentage of them. So as a result, we've got a market that's filled with, again, like I said, schlock. And Steam in particular has disappointed me progressively more and more with what it allows. And it's not out of a want for censorship or anything like that, but the bar has been set so low for what's acceptable. And for Valve, it makes sense, you know. If they can take whatever percentage cut off of every sale, you know, does it really matter to them? If it doesn't explicitly cut into their player base for their other major releases that are the real money makers, do they care? Probably not. So until they actually see the economic repercussions of shitting up their own store, they probably won't stop anyone. So, yeah. So to bring it back around, I guess, to walking simulators and how to present narrative in games, I want to see more. I don't want to see any more walking simulators. I want to see games that are willing to take leaps as far as what a game can be, only if it is the right way to present their narrative. You know, there's plenty of games out there that took gameplay leaps purely for the sake of, hey, we've got this really good idea. I mean, the original Portal could be actually argued that way of, it doesn't have a lot of narrative there. You know, the story isn't very good. But that was a sea change as far as the theory on what could be done in a first-person game to some extent. And so the opposite side, or a different edge of that, I suppose, is the attempt to make a narrative-only, non-combat, first-person narrative-driven game with fairly limited success. And I can't speak to too much in the genre in general, like I said. I don't know. Gone Home could be a great masterpiece. But something tells me it isn't. Something tells me it probably would have been better as a novella. But somebody probably wanted to make some money. Somebody probably wanted to make it in new media instead of old media. You know, books don't sell like they used to. At least not amongst the younger, newer, millennial generations. Lord, do I hate that word. Yeah. Don't make walking sims. Write a book. Hand your manuscript to somebody and ask them what they think. Tell them if you don't see red on every page, you're going to hand it back to them and make them edit it again. It's a lot harder to shit out a bad book than it is to shit out a bad game. Because a book only has one dimension. It's the words you put on the page. A game can have ever so many. In a sea of shit, the shit with glitter on it stands out. What a terrible analogy. Let's end on that.